Hello and welcome to a special discussion for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. 48 hours after the budget was presented, it's time for us to move beyond the initial details we know and talk about the problems and the concerns and issues that haven't got the attention they deserve. And when we do so, could it change our initial impression of the budget? With me to hold this discussion are five of India's most highly regarded economists, industrialists, and bankers. They are the Managing Director of the Overseas Development Institute in London, Ratin Roy, the Chief Emerging Markets Economist of JP Morgan Bank in America, Jahangir Aziz, Professor of Economics at Amherst University and Jawaharlal Nehru University, Jayati Ghosh, co-chairman of Forbes Marshall and the former chairman of CII, Naushad Forbes, and professor of economics and a member of the 13th Finance Commission, Indira Raja Raman. Let me start by putting to a couple of you a set of questions to get your overall broad impression of the budget before I come to specific issues announced by the finance minister 2 days ago. Now, Ratin Roy, in your Business Standard article yesterday, you called this a business as usual budget with no evidence of an economic strategy that would address the scarring caused by the pandemic. You clearly sounded disappointed. What were you hoping for that wasn't announced?
I've long stopped hoping for anything from this budget, from budgets that this government produces. For a while, I hoped for fiscal responsibility, but obviously this is not the year when you hope for that. So let me start by very quickly explaining why I think it's business as usual. A large part of the widening of the fiscal deficit has happened because the government has failed to collect revenues and receipts. It's not that the government has failed to collect tax and non-tax revenues any more than it normally does. That would be expected since a pandemic means the tax base shrinks. In fact, they've had a good ride there because they've got lots of money from petroleum excise because petroleum prices fell. Pump prices quite rightly did not. So petroleum excise collections were buoyant. It's not that. It's the collapse of disbursement proceeds from 210,000 crores to 32,000 crores in a year when the private sector, especially the private corporate sector, has been making money hand over fist. We have what people like Sajid Chinoy and Pranjul Bhandari have called a profit-led recovery. The stock markets are buoyant. The capital markets are great. That collapse accounts for approximately 1/3 of the incremental fiscal deficit. Of the remainder, approximately 80% has gone, quite rightly, I suppose, to feeding people. I'm not saying whether it was done well or badly. I'm saying the money was allocated in different forms to different kinds of food subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, etc. And about 10% has gone to an increase in Narega, which is basically so what you have done is you've made sure that in the pandemic, in the midst of a profit-led recovery, when wages were collapsing, employment was collapsing, that people didn't starve. Now, I was hoping what the budget would say either for next year or would reveal has been done in this year, given all the talk about income support and fiscal stimulus, is that something more would be done other than preventing people from starving. And it is very disappointing, but not surprising, frankly, that this has not happened. Any government, even a colonial government, can provide relief and should in times of crisis and exigency. But I expect my national government to do more. And that
In other words, the national government has failed to do more for those who are the most needy. In a nutshell, that is a key concern for you.
For those who had livelihoods, jobs, and wages before the pandemic, who have been scarred, while those who had assets and profits have not been scarred or derived the money from the stock market. The evidence is well before you. And of course, the small people who produce small things, the MSMEs. That has not happened. There is also the question of capital expenditure, which I shall defer, so you can bring others in, and I can come back to that if you like later. Thank you.
Naushad Forbes, many people were hoping for a budget that would fire up animal spirits, encourage investment, and therefore lift growth. Speaking as an industrialist, and also as an illustrious former chairman of CII, has this budget done that for you?
So, I on the first day when I heard the budget speech, the phrase that I used was the same as Rathin's: business as usual budget. I always worry that when you start reading the detail in the annexures, there will be some devil. I have to say that this time I've been relatively pleasantly surprised with some of the detail in the annexures. And let me give you an illustration of what I mean. Because I feel, first of all, that there's been consistency in taxation. There's been no change made in either corporate or personal income taxes. In a year that's been quite unprecedented, instead, the deficit has been allowed to rise. I see that consistency as actually a very positive thing because it gives you certainty about the future. And that is certainty is one of the drivers, if you ask me, of a good investment climate. Second, the budget's clearly betting on growth. It's betting on 14% nominal GDP growth and 16% revenue growth for the government itself. It's allowing the deficit to rise very substantially this year, but some of that deficit rise, I think, is actually positive in two respects. First, the subsidy that used to go by way of the food subsidy through the Food Corporation of India has now been brought into the budget instead of the fudge that we've had in the past of loans being, it's being the actual subsidy being hidden in the form of loans that were made to the Food Corporation of India. I think that's a positive thing. Okay. Second, the fertilizer subsidy has been, I first found that the fertilizer subsidy next year was half of this year's. So I said, what's going on? There was no announcement about that. Then when we looked at it in more detail, we found that actually the government has paid last year and this year's fertilizer subsidy this year. So it's actually now recognizing things that it owes in the budget itself. I see that as a very, again, positive sign. Having said that, I have one more positive thing. Some of the wording, the use of the word privatization is very healthy, and the announcement that 2 public sector banks and 1 insurance company will be privatized, very healthy. I think all those are very positive moves. I have 2 concerns. One on implementation. For precisely the point that Rathin mentioned on disinvestment or privatization, given our track record this year, what we achieved last year, what we achieved the year before, okay, how are we going to actually deliver on the budgeted 1.76 lakh crore of disinvestment receipts that we've budgeted now? And maybe we can talk about that in more detail. And the second concern I have is on the trade front. If you look at, until 2017, every year saw India being more open than it was the previous year, from 1991 through 2017. In the last 4 years, every year has seen us become more and more protectionist. I was hoping that the budget would change direction and would announce a series of opening ups to the world and reduction in tariffs. We've been promised an import policy by the 1st of October. Let's wait and see what that delivers. But I'm concerned about the continued rise in import tariffs on more and more items.
But in a nutshell, before I go to someone else, you began by saying that when you heard the budget 2 days ago, you thought it was business as usual. You were pleased that there weren't too many hidden tricks in the details. Yeah. Is it still a business as usual budget 2 days later? Or are you now more impressed? A quick answer.
I think there are elements. If the government delivers on privatization, if the government delivers on, the slogan that was announced again, which had been forgotten for a few years, of minimum government, maximum governance, if we see some steps in that direction, then I think it will go beyond a business as usual budget. If we don't see that delivery, it's a business as usual budget.
In other words, the government has to deliver and walk the talk. At the moment, the jury is technically still out. Let's at this point come to some of the details in the budget. And let me start with those that are areas where the government has done things And then after that come to areas where the government either hasn't done anything or perhaps not done enough. Now, Jyoti Ghosh, let's start with the finance minister's announcement that expenditure on health has increased by 137% to 2.23 lakh crore. But when you look at the details, 60,000 crore is for drinking water, 36,000 crore for sanitation, 35,000 crore for COVID vaccinations, and presumably those are just a one-off. And then when you look at the actual outlay for health, that's fallen almost 10% from an RE of 82,500 crore to 74,600 crore. What do you make of this package on health?
I think, unfortunately, it's a smoke and mirrors exercise. As you mentioned, most of it is actually not for health per se. Nearly 50,000 crore is actually going to state governments as part of a finance commission award. So it's not part of the central government purview at all. It shouldn't be in the budget. So I think there's a lot of attempt to make out that we're spending more on health rather than actual spending, which frankly it's not just a disaster, it's a catastrophe, because we have had such a major health toll, not only because of COVID-19, which in fact we've been a little better than many other countries, but because of the impact on other health and on nutrition. All of those sectors, which are absolutely critical, whether it is, the ICDS, whether it is all of the other kinds of expenditures that enable minimal nutrition and health access for a large part of the population, have been either cut or not increased at all during one of the most severe crises of health, nutrition, livelihoods that we faced in the country. So I think overall, if you look at the spending on health that the central government has done in the first 9 months, April to December, it's less than 0.3% of GDP. Normally, it's about 0.3%. This time, it's less. They claim they're going to spend more in the last 3 months. They haven't done it. What stopped them from spending more so far? I doubt that they will actually spend more. The RE claims that they will suddenly spend more in the last 3 months. But so far, what does it mean? It means that they have really not taken this seriously as a health crisis, and they have not increased the critical areas that would actually improve the health conditions of ordinary people. Next year, you're going to see a further decline. So I think that's really quite shocking. All the critical areas that would affect the possibility of people to lead a healthy life, the rural employment guarantee, food, etc., all facing cuts. I just want to highlight what Mr. Forbes said. I completely agree that it's very welcome that they're making it transparent, the food and fertilizer subsidy, but they really had no choice. The Food Corporation of India would not be viable anymore because of the huge amount of debt it has been taking for 5 years. And the CAG had told them you have to do it. So these are not increases. Ratin, it's not a real increase in food expenditure. If you look at the actual procurement and distribution, things are going up. They are not distributing more food.
We'll come to food in a moment's time, but to come back to health, what you're saying to me is that the finance minister thought she would impress the country with what she claimed was a 137% increase. You're saying this is smoke and mirrors. Critical areas have not got increases. Critical areas have had seen actual allocations slashed. So you're not just not impressed. You're disappointed and disillusioned. In a nutshell, would that be correct?
I won't say disillusioned because I don't think I had too many illusions, but certainly I would have imagined that at a time like this, with such an immense economic downswing and such a major livelihood crisis, that there would be much more attention, certainly, to health.
Indira Rajaraman, the other second big push in the budget was in terms of infrastructure. Once again, with great pride, the finance minister pointed out that capex has increased by 34.5% to a new total of 5.54 lakh crore. And then she added, and many of the papers seem to have forgotten this, but she added there's a further 2 lakh crore for the states and what she called autonomous bodies. Now, together, prima facie, that looks like a huge sum of money. But do you have problems or questions about the capacity of our system to spend this amount of money? Could it be that when the financial year ends, a large amount of this will be either unspent or, worse still, tied up in bureaucratic knots?
Before I answer the question you put to me, let me do a small correction to the figures. The increase of 34% is really BE to BE. But if you look at the RE for this year, which is 4.4 trillion, then the increase is more like 26%, which is good. I mean, I have no complaints about that, but just a small correction. The other thing is that the amount going to states, which is 2.2 trillion, is actually a little bit below the 2.3 trillion, which is in the RE for the current year. Once again, no complaints, but just a small correction. These are not wildly higher, and in the case of what's going to states, just a little bit lower than what we have in the RE estimates for this year. Of course, we have to wait to see the actuals to see what will actually happen. Now to your question.
Can I stop you there for a second? It's a very important point you've made. I'm just clarifying for the audience that you're correcting the figures the finance minister herself announced. I was quoting her verbatim when I said 34.5%. I was quoting her verbatim when she talked about 2 lakh crore, and very rightly you pointed out that actually RE to BE is only 26, not 34. She presented it cleverly to make it seem bigger than it was. And in fact, the allocation for the states is marginally less than last year, not more.
Yeah.
Please carry on. Please carry on.
But not blaming the finance minister. It's a tough call, the exercise she had to do, but just a small correction. On whether the funds will lie unspent. No, I have no fears that the funds will lie unspent. Because what they're looking at, as far as I could tell from the budget speech and so on, are the projects lined up in the national infrastructure pipeline, which we are told are shovel-ready projects. These are not projects which are waiting for clearances of various kinds. They're ready to go. And so I have no worry about unspent funds waiting for clearances. That said, I am deeply disappointed about the fact, and I've been writing about this for a long time, the important thing to do at this juncture is for us to complete incomplete infrastructure projects. By the government's own figures issued in October 2020, 70% of the large central infrastructure projects that they had surveyed were lying incomplete and delayed, and the average delay was 3.5 years. So if the funds were to go instead to completion of those projects, what we would gain would be an addition to the productive capacity of the economy this fiscal, or rather the coming fiscal year, instead of several years into the future, which is what would happen if you were to go into new projects in the NIP pipeline. And when you consider that these incomplete projects in that report, which is in the public domain, are in rail and road connectivity to ports, among other things, then you can see the urgency of the need to complete those projects. And very quickly, why did those projects lie incomplete? They lay incomplete for the most part because contractors were not paid their dues. So contractors had to leave the project site and workers had to put down their tools. So with that qualification, if this 5+ trillion were to go into completing past infrastructure projects, then I, for one, would cheer.
If it doesn't, and I'm now borrowing from the article you wrote for Mint yesterday, you said that our landscape was dotted with incomplete projects. If your caution isn't borne in mind, we could be adding to that landscape with more incomplete projects. In other words, we could become a country of incomplete projects, good intentions never taken to fruition.
Well, let's hope and pray that doesn't happen. We'll be a country in the forthcoming year of new infrastructure projects started with the hope that they will be completed.
Absolutely. But I was simply pointing out that one of the dangers in the commitment made by the finance minister is that if intent is not followed all the way to fruition, we could have more incomplete projects. At this moment, we don't know whether that will happen or not. Jahangir Aziz, another key reform that's attracted enormous attention both on television and in the newspapers is the announcement to increase FDI insurance from 49 to 74%. And if this happens, and there's a huge if there, because already there are political voices speaking out from the RSS in criticism, if it happens, it will not just expand the insurance sector in a huge way, but it will also make available very large sums for long-term investment. But what I want to ask is this: do foreign insurers have concerns about the way the life insurance market and the general insurance market works? And secondly, would they also be perturbed by the requirement that the majority of the directors and key management must be Indian? Would those be two areas that would make them think very carefully?
I think even before we get to that, Mr. Thapar, I think, we need to look at, why would you want to increase FDI? I think as a general principle, it's a good thing. As part of general industrial policy, you don't want to distort between foreigners and domestic investors simply because it creates, an uneven field and it impedes competition. And so you want to limit that only to very core areas which are of national security interest. So in that sense, this is a good step. And we should extend this step to other areas that are of non-core interest to the government and to national policy. And why stop at 74%, want a full 100%? I think the other two reasons as to why you want to do a specific increase in a specific sector, you want to increase FDI, are twofold. One is that sector actually doesn't have capital. So if you look at the last 3-4 years, or probably even 5 years, apart from life insurance, Indian companies or joint ventures haven't really made money in general insurance. And several of the existing foreign joint venture partners have actually left India. But in none of them, and I'm not an expert in this field, but in none of them, I've heard the complaints that this is because they don't have controlling share. In fact, if you look at, the government had allowed insurance company, shareholding to move from 24% to 49%. Very few of the companies actually pushed up their, shareholding even up to 49%. So I really don't think that, that there was a complaint that there wasn't enough money in terms of, promotion capital that was a binding constraint. And at the same token, if I look at globally, I look at global insurance market, there are no global insurance companies with so much excess capital that they're seeking opportunities somewhere else in the world. So, both of the demand and the supply is not really sure that capital constraint is the reason as to why you needed to increase the FDI limit. That brings you to a point that you raised, which is that, the state of the market, insurance market in India. And I think that one key concern, one reason as to why you want to bring in foreigners is that the foreigners would bring in, new products. And new products are important because these new products allow people to, have better risk management. They reduce the price of risk management. And over here, the complaint across the industry is that it is not that, they don't have the know-how, but that regulations are so intrusive and in fact so antiquated that their ability to provide new products is very, very limited. So much so that if you look at general insurance market, then in the general insurance market, the competition has not been on new products. Instead, because they could not expand in new products, they have competed on premium. And the premiums have gone down to such an extent that Indian general insurance products are very difficult to reinsure globally. So I think the focus should have been on, liberalizing the regulations, modernizing the regulations. And I know that, the global financial crisis, gave a bad rap to insurance company, but, that was long time back. So I think if they really wanted to push this insurance company, to advance, I think the focus should have been on regulations. And, this is not a bad step, but I really don't think it will meaningfully change the landscape of insurance companies.
That's very interesting. You make two very important points. One, that foreign insurance companies aren't actually itching to come to India. And secondly, they're going to be very concerned about the nature of regulations in this market. And whilst those regulations remain, their enthusiasm to walk through the door is going to be fairly limited. Ratin Roy, I want to put two quick questions to you, because as I heard the discussion just now, I remembered something you wrote in your Business Standard article yesterday, where you pointed out that over the last 2-3 years, the percentage of the revenue, the percentage of the government deficit that was eaten up by the revenue deficit was roughly between 75 and 76%. And next year, if anything, that percentage is going to increase to possibly 77%. That suggests that the government's deficit is not going into new investment, it's going into salaries. And that raises question marks about the quality of the deficit and the way it's being used. Have I summed up your thoughts from that article correctly?
Not well. I think my emphasis was different. I wasn't necessarily saying that capital expenditure is better than revenue expenditure. That's a longer conversation. I was making the point that the government claims to have significantly increased action using public resources in capital expenditure. And I'm challenging that. So here are some basic facts. In India, since 1981, the government has been unable to finance its current expenditure, salaries, pensions, taxes, transfers, using the taxes it collects and the stuff it privatizes, tax and non-tax revenue and non-debt capital receipts. That number has gone up secularly from about 3.5% in 1981. So this is a bipartisan matter, up to about 69 to 70% when this government came to office. Mr. Jaitley brought it down by 3 percentage points, but the point is it hovers between, let's be charitable, 66 and 77, which means between 2/3 and 3/4 of government borrowing is used not to finance capital expenditure, right? So the central government for some time now has simply not been a major budgetary player in the business of capital expenditure. If the claim this year is that there's been a structural shift in how the government is using its money, I reject that because of the data you just cited.
Absolutely. In fact, what you pointed out is that next year, not 75, 76% of the government money will go into revenue deficits, 77%.
Exactly. So we are hovering, these are estimates. We are hovering between 1%. There's no new action here. Okay. There's no new action here. Now, the only reason why you're seeing an increase in rupees crores in capital expenditure is that the fiscal deficit has widened. Not because the government has taken a structural decision to spend more on public investment and less on public consumption.
That's
so therefore, it follows, if this continues, that when you reduce the fiscal deficit, you will go back to business as usual.
Absolutely, and a very good point. Don't get too enthused by the size of the fiscal deficit and believe it's all going into investment. 77% is going into salary. Let me come to the second question, because I think it's an important one. I want to raise with you two sectors of the economy which suffered during the lockdown. MSMEs, which account for 30% of GDP, 45% of manufacturing, and are set to employ up to 12 crore people. And then there's the unorganized sector, which provides employment for over 91, 92% of the population. Now, I know that MSME allocation has doubled, but it's only an additional 7,000 crore. And when it comes to the unorganized sector, does the finance minister have a credible way of reaching out to them, or is that the problem? So do you think these two, the unorganized sector and the MSMEs, haven't got the attention they deserve?
Well, I don't think that this is a matter of some imperial fiat from the Delhi Sultanate. So we must go and look at the economy. What's happened in this economy? One thing that's happened in this economy for sure is that there's been a profit-led recovery. That such growth that we have had has happened on the income side through an increase in profits. Now, it follows, if it's a shrinking economy, that you don't make profits by producing more at the macroeconomic level. So you're making profits by producing less and increasing your margin. You're increasing your margin by cutting costs. There are two ways you can cut costs. You can pay people less, you can employ fewer people, or you can pay less to your suppliers, or you can get rid of suppliers. That is why I am arguing, given these facts, that we know, we are not speculating anymore, that the bulk of the impact of this pandemic on lives and livelihoods has been felt by wage earners, small businesses, and the unorganized sector. Now, there are other reasons for that. I'm not saying that this was something deliberate, that Mr. Ambani goes debt-free and makes money.
Let's not go into the reasons why these sectors suffered, because in a sense, that's part of the past. Let me ask you.
I'm not going into that. I'm saying that is, however, an outcome I must.
Let me ask you.
That's an outcome I must recognize.
I was simply going to say, has this budget done enough to alleviate and address the distress of the MSME sector and the unorganized sector? Or is the unorganized sector an area where she hasn't got credible ways of reaching out?
I take your point. surprising. But at very minimum, I would say this government has what any colonial government does. It provided relief. So if the government had decided to,
Dr. Roy, we're losing you. I think I'll go to someone else, come back to you later. We've lost the connection to you. Hopefully it'll get better in a moment's time. Mr. Forbes, let's go.
The economic outcomes you're seeing would not have panned out. And these economic outcomes, I'm afraid, already have panned out. So that suffering has already happened. That is very important.
No, Dr. Roy, I'm going to have to stop. We are losing you. I'll come back to you later. Mr. Forbes, what about sectors like hotels, restaurants, airlines, and tourism, and a lot of the service industry as well? Would you agree that these are areas where at best the budget indirectly or tangentially helps them, but certainly not directly?
I think very much so. You know, the tourism sector has been the hardest hit, not just in India, but around the world as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns. People have just stopped moving around and traveling and staying in hotels. So it's affected the tourism sector everywhere. How could the budget have helped? The budget did try to do one thing in the longer term, which is the investment in infrastructure. In the long run, infrastructure will help tourism because it will enable more people to move around more easily. It will enable more in the way of construction and so on to happen, and it will help tourism. In the short run, there was nothing specific for the tourism sector. And I would actually argue that throughout this pandemic and throughout the real stress that the tourism sector, including airlines, hotels, the whole lot, restaurants have felt, that there's been very little that's been done in the form of direct support. The two measures that were more widely available to the sector were MSME loan guarantees and one-time restructuring, which was expected to be taken up by larger companies. The take-up of the one-time restructuring has been very minimal, and the MSME loan guarantees work if you have loans. If you do not have loans, let's say a very small restaurant or something like that does not have loans, then how do you actually keep people employed? What is the kind of support you get? And actually, I think there's been no support that's really been forthcoming for the tourism sector more broadly. So I think in the longer term, growth might see the recovery of the sector going forward. In the short run, the sector has to survive and get through the current period.
And do you think that by failing to focus more clearly and do more for this sector, because tourism is a very large employer, the government has actually erred? Would you go that far?
So, you know, if you look at what I've been thinking about is I do feel that the tourism sector requires help. The question would be, what can the government do, and what can the government do in the budget to help the sector if it chooses to, right? And there are some specific things that it can do. For example, there's a service tax rebate that the sector gets. Speeding up that rebate, I'm told by friends who operate in the sector, would be very directly helpful to them. There's some specific things like that one could perhaps do. Beyond that, what can one expect in the budget that would actually help the tourism sector, especially the tourism sector that is largely informal?
Okay, you're saying a very interesting...
I don't know.
You're saying there's not much in the budget the finance minister could have done to help the tourism sector, but there are a few things like the service rebate you mentioned, which could have been done, but haven't been done. So what you're really saying is that even where she could have acted to help a sector in deep distress, she hasn't taken the initiative. J.K. Ghosh, now I noticed, and in a sense you were hinting about this in your first answer, I noticed that subsidies for food, fertilizer, and LPG, or the allocation for NREGA, has been cut variously, somewhere between 30 and 60% compared to this year's RE. Is that understandable? Because these were emergency relief measures needed for the lockdown? Or is the need for relief still there, and therefore cutting these allocations becomes a serious mistake?
Well, look, I think first we have to recognize that these allocations were not real in that sense. They were just making transparent something which the government should have been doing all along, which is to recognize that the Food Corporation is taking on expenditures and that it must pay for those. What it was doing was forcing the Food Corporation to actually take on loans, and the controller, the CAG, stopped them from doing that, and which is why they have actually suddenly now had to put in a larger allocation for the FCI. It has not been reflected in much greater provision of food to people. I want to emphasize this. Ratin keeps saying they provided more relief. They have not. In fact, if you look internationally, there is no country in the world that has provided less relief, even Mexico, which is the other country doing fiscal austerity. So we haven't provided enough in terms of food. The fertilizer subsidy is the same story. It's just making something more transparent. And what they've clearly decided is that this is a once for all transparency this year, but from next year, we'll go back to our bad old ways.
Can I ask you specifically about the decision to cut the NREGA allocation when you compare last year's RE with this year's BE by something like 30%? This has happened at a time when NREGA's own statistics show that up to the 10th of January, something like 10 crore people had availed of this facility, 21% over last year. Presumably, that would lead one to believe that the need for an increased allocation remains, and yet the government has slashed it by 30%. What do you make of that?
Well, absolutely. But, first of all, we make a mistake by looking at allocation because Manrega is actually a demand-driven program. Legally, the government cannot withhold funds. The fact that it has been withholding funds continuously is a different matter. Legally, they cannot. We cannot restrict Manrega spending by budgetary allocation of the central government. Nonetheless, if we're doing that, how does it work? They don't pay the states. And the states then run the deficits. And every year, the first allocation of the year financially, between 6 to 15,000 crore is just repaying the arrears of the previous year. That's terrible for the program because it actually means that states can't pay wages, there are arrears in payment, they cut down on their own spending. It's a real reflection of the cynicism of the central government not to ensure that there is sufficient allocation for Manrega at such a critical time when the livelihood crisis is bigger than it was.
You're making a very important point that I want to underline for the audience because most people forget about it or are perhaps even unaware of it. NREGA is demand driven. The government is legally duty bound, not just morally bound, but legally duty bound to meet whatever demand there is and fund it as required. In other words, you can't limit it to whatever allocation you choose to put into the budget. That's an arbitrary allocation and it contravenes the legal requirement. Let me at that point bring you in, Indira Rajaraman, and slightly enhance this discussion to talk about the whole problem of unemployment. The Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy says that employment by the end of December had fallen by 14.7 million. Private surveys suggest it's fallen by perhaps 18 million. And as I mentioned a moment ago, NREGA's own records show that up to the 10th of January, 10 crore had availed of this facility, a 21% increase over last year. Now, no doubt, the stress the budget for next year puts on infrastructure will create jobs, but that has a long-term gestation. It's not going to yield anything necessarily in 4, 5, or 6 months. It could take even longer. And NREGA, as I pointed out a moment ago, has been slashed by 30%. So beyond the investment in the mega textile parks, I think there are 7 of them, how much relief is there in this budget for the unemployed?
Just a small correction. The CMI figures show that employment has fallen, not that unemployment has fallen. Yeah. So going on to your question, what has the government actually done for jobs? If you want to provide jobs to people, you can do it in one of 2 ways. You can move the jobs to where people are, and that is what Manrega tries to do. Or you can move people to where the jobs are. Now, I totally agree. I mean, it's a fact that the NREGA allocation has been cut. But I think it is widely known that this is a demand-driven scheme. In fact, that was the great thing about it. And it's also widely understood that any budgetary allocation for an open-ended program like that would necessarily be a provisional allocation. But what it does reflect is that the government expects that instead of having to move jobs to people, that there will be enough jobs for people to move to. In that connection, what have they done? What have they done to encourage people to move and not to fear mobility? Well, there is the vaccination program. I don't think enough of a budgetary allocation has been made for that, but it is a beginning. But more importantly, the One Nation, One Ration Card move has been very important because in giving migrants a share of their household ration card, it does remove that fear they have when they move. It does give them, to that extent, some food security. I would have been much happier if the free food that was given to ration card holders up to the end of November had been reintroduced with the start of the new fiscal year and gone on for 6 months. That would have meant that migrants could not only get their share, but they could get it free of cost. And that would have encouraged movement a little more. And if I have another minute, I'll talk about a program that has, in my opinion, been a very good program in the current year, started in the current year. It was the performance-linked incentive, which is now in place for 13 sectors. The problem with that is that these are sectors identified at the center. If it had been federally structured, by which I mean if the program had linked center to states, to district industrial centers, then we could have properly encouraged local initiatives of various kinds, encourage them to scale up. And lastly, I will just conclude. I spoke about how you want to encourage people to move to where the jobs are. But at the same time, if you were to have this center, state, local connect, you would reduce the distance that they have to travel if you have a spatial spread of employment and jobs, so that they don't have to travel thousands of kilometers, but maybe just a few 100 kilometers in order to get a good job.
That's an almost encyclopedic answer, and I thank you for it. Let me very, very quickly ask you if you agree with 2 sentences written by Mahesh Vyas, the CEO of the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, in today's Business Standard. He's talking specifically about what the budget has done for employment and jobs. He says, and I'm quoting him, "The government of India does not recognize any employment problem in the country." And then he says, "The finance minister's speech contained no specific scheme to help the unemployed or to generate employment directly." Would you agree with those 2 sentences?
Well, there is NREGA, which moves jobs to people. But in the movement of people,
by 30%, it's been slashed by 30%.
That's a provision. Yeah, that's a provisional allocation. The hope is that people would move to jobs, and the government does not actually have to provide all those jobs, as long as it sets up a system where people lose their fear of moving to jobs. And the ONORC, if supplemented by free food, would have been a great move. The other point I wanted to make was it's a small segment of the budget speech, but there has been a roping in of the United Arab Emirates and Japan towards skilling and vocational training of people that they will employ in their respective countries. That's also a very good initiative. So in short, the government cannot do more than take jobs to the people, which it is doing through Manrega, but the slashed allocation does mean that the hope is that there will be jobs for people to move to. I just wish that there had been a federal linking of center, states, and local government so that people could move to jobs nearer their homes.
When you talk, and you've done this repeatedly in those 2 answers about the government encouraging people to move to jobs, it reminded me of Norman Tebbit in Thatcherite England, when jobs were becoming scarce, and he said to the country, "Get on your bike and go find a job." It didn't work in England at the time. I'm not sure whether the Indian people are going to be getting on what may be, in their case, non-existent bikes to go find jobs. But that's just a comment from me and nothing more. Jahangir Aziz, in a very real sense, the question...
Sharon, I hate to interrupt, but I actually have to leave you in 5 minutes to join this other meeting. So
Okay, we'll say bye-bye to you now, but we will miss you when you're gone. Jahangir Aziz, in a very real sense, the discussion that we're having leads almost directly to the issue I want to raise with you. In your articles, you've repeatedly argued that what India needs to do to help households in distress and to help small businesses like MSMEs that are in dire straits is income support. As you pointed out in your articles, this would create demand, it would increase consumption, and most importantly, it would provide incentives for investment. But that's not a route the finance minister has walked down at all. Would you say she's
Uh,
made a mistake?
yeah, I mean, so I think, first of all, I mean, I've been hearing this conversation, and I think we need to sort of step back and take a deep breath. India is not the only country under the sun that has a pandemic. Many people have talked about, that this pandemic has made life very difficult for the budget. In fact, if anything, this pandemic made life much easier for the budget because it took away the usual, typical policy choices that we need to make in every budget. There wasn't really very much choices to make. If you look across the globe, from the US to China, every country under the sun in some form or the other has provided income support. US is the extreme where all three fiscal packages has purely been targeted towards income support. Brazil has provided about 8% of GDP of additional expenditure, of which 4 percentage points of GDP has been income support. The reason why people are doing income support, because every country realizes that as the economies recover from the pandemic, there is also serious scarring, which we keep talking about in the labor market. We have serious scarrings on balance sheets of SMEs and households, but more generally, economic imbalances in all of these economies have widened. And I think in the case of India specifically, we have 13.5% growth rate forecasted for fiscal year 2022, which is probably significantly higher than that of the government. It is significantly higher than consensus. But even with a 13.5% growth rate, if you look at the level of GDP by the end of 2022, India will still be about 5-6 percentage points lower than its pre-pandemic path. The Economic Survey, which has a lower growth path, has 10 percentage points lower than its pre-pandemic path. But if you look at these numbers and convert them into what is the real income loss, then on average, it's about $200 to $300 billion of income loss that would have taken place in fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22. And disproportionately, that would fall on households and would fall on SMEs. Why do we know that? Well, Rothin pointed that out, Sajid, Pranjul have also pointed it out, that if you look at the data, listed companies have actually made significantly higher profit. So the non-listed company part of the economy made up of households and SME must have actually declined. And I think the concern is the following, that with this kind of scarring and this kind on the labor market, you talked about 18 million job losses. If you look at the impact that such kind of income losses can create to balance sheets, there is a fear. And the fear is that, we get the vaccination rolling, mobility returns, everybody gets down to work. But then exactly at that point, when SMEs and households need credit from the banking sector, the banks basically turn risk averse because there is no collateral on which they can provide credit. And the concern is that this, recovery that we are looking at could well turn out into a dead cat bounce if these imbalances are allowed to widen. So it's not even a medium-term problem of inequality, poverty, widening gender gap. It is a near-term problem, a problem in the second half of 2021 that we might be facing.
So in a nutshell, and answer me with a yes or no, what you're saying, although you haven't said it so explicitly, the finance minister made a terrible mistake not heeding your advice to give income support to households and small businesses. It is a mistake on her part not to do so.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I've been pointing that out several times. Yes.
Thank you very much. You couldn't have been clearer when you said yes loudly and boldly. Ratin Roy, Before I come to my question, I wanted to have a chance to answer that last question when the line broke up and we couldn't make out what you were saying. You were answering the question, has the government done enough to assist two sectors that are in dire straits? MSMEs, which are 40% of manufacturing, 30% of GDP, and the unorganized sector, which creates something like 91, 92% of jobs? Or is the problem that it hasn't got good ways of reaching out to these sectors? Can you answer that question first?
Very briefly and easily, now that Jahangir has had his say on income support, which I must also point out, Karan, to your viewers, is actually, I don't know what economists exist within the government of India anymore. But if you look at the economists that I've been reading across the spectrum, more or less, there has been near universal consensus that income support was necessary. They have been pleased for this since April. Some of us fiscal people have written and told the government what they seem to have discovered now, that the money is there if you spend it properly. And spending that money properly would have involved doing that, saying that, okay, your monetary policy measures and other things have enabled, listed companies to make money. So who are the people who are actually bearing the downside? And that is the unorganized sector, for reasons Naushad mentioned. Many of them work in informal services, etc. Those places have been hit. So essentially, supporting their incomes should have been a very important part of the fiscal business of the government of India. Now, it is true that the government of India does not have the instrumentation and the, if you like, the granularity to be able to do that effectively, because it is the government of India. And therefore, what it would need to do is to empower the states and the subnational governments to do so by generously providing grant financing to enable them to bring it out in a calibrated way. That would, of course, mean that you would have to share the credit for a successful income support scheme with other governments. And I think that was the binding constraint here, and that is why, quite regrettably, it was not done. So the fact that the government of India did not have the direct instrumentation did not mean that the instrumentation was not available. Okay. If the government of India had thought to collaborate with others, which it obviously, in my mind, for political reasons, chose not to.
You're making a very important point, and it's a partly political point, that there were things the government could have done to address the dire straits in which the unorganized sector and the MSMEs are. And very largely that amounts to direct income support, but it would have to be done through state governments. And that would mean sharing credit with the likes of Mamata Banerjee in Bengal, just to take her as an example, and that would have raised political problems, and the government perhaps for that reason ducked it. It's not that there weren't things they could not do. There were things they could, but they chose not to. Let me, however, put one more question to you, and this time it's an area where perhaps the government deserves a bit of credit. The finance minister this time around seems to have gone out of her way to make the fiscal deficit a real figure. At 9.5%, there are very few off-budget items that are not actually accounted for. Next year, it will still be a high fiscal deficit at 6.8, and it's only going to come down to 4.5 in 25-26. My question is simple. Is this fiscal honesty, and how much credit do you give Nirmala Sitharaman?
I have come to accept very low standards. So I give her full credit. I give this government, obviously, full credit. Not just because of that, Mr. Thapar, also because you see this government had stopped mentioning macro-fiscal numbers at all in the budget speech. Now, that is very important. The budget speech is the articulation on record of the government's intentions, and the government is accountability bound, therefore, to whatever it says in the budget speech. If you put it in the appendices, the budget documents, it is not so accountable. So for years, I took it for granted that these things would be mentioned in the budget speech. Last year, they just gave up. There was nothing in the budget speech. So it was great that she put it in the budget speech, because then the things that Joyati is afraid of, that bad habits will come, etc., we at least have some accountability. I think it was a very good thing to do. I think that I really hope that we praise her and her government and her ministry to the skies on this front, so that they don't go back to the bad habits of and ghosts past.
Naushad Hobbs, let's move from an area where perhaps praise was justifiably due to the government to an area where, prima facie, it looks as if we have a very strange fudge. I'm talking about the disinvestment target. Now, to begin with, all of this year's items, which were not disinvested, will be disinvested next year. And that includes Air India, BPCL, the Container Corporation, the Shipping Corporation. Then on top of that, the government intends to disinvest 2 public sector banks and a general insurance company. And thirdly, the stock market is booming. And yet the target for next year's disinvestment is just 1.75 lakh crore, which is 35,000 crore less than this year. And it seems to me that there can only be 2 possibilities here. Either this reflects the fact that the finance minister believes she cannot disinvest all the companies she wants to, or she believes she's not going to get the sort of money she thinks she should get. Which of the two?
So I really feel that the disinvestment target is less important than, given exactly the reason that you said, that that we haven't met it this year. Even if you look at last year's numbers, right? We were way behind at the time of the budget on the 1st of February. We then had a revised estimate for the year, and we didn't come anywhere near meeting that either. So even in the remaining 2 months of the year, we didn't achieve what we said we would on the 1st of February. So there's a big credibility gap in us actually achieving the disinvestment targets that have been set each of the last few years. Here's what I would suggest. I would suggest that the reason that this has not happened is because it has been somehow left to the individual ministries that these firms come under to carry out the disinvestment program. Remember what happened when we did have a successful disinvestment program, which is the only time was in the first NDA government, the Vajpayee government, when Arun Shuri was the minister for disinvestment. And we actually saw a flow of public sector units that were disinvested at that time, privatized indeed at that time. I think we need a similar kind of construct now, which is that the units that are going to be privatized, disinvested, whatever, are pulled out from their respective ministries, put into a separate ministry with the authority to handle those companies in a different ministry, with the ministry where the only task that ministry has is to actually disinvest. I think if we do something like that with adequate political backing, we can then see some movement in this direction that is much more substantial than the, I would say, window dressing that we've actually seen, which is of having one public sector company's shares bought by another public sector company from the government. That's not really disinvestment. That's window dressing. And I think to see substantial progress, we need to approach it much more politically, much more as a separate entity within the government that would only have this as the responsibility.
I'll simply add one point. It's not just the need for a specific disinvestment ministry that Vajpayee created and Arun Shuri was minister of. It's also the fact that you need the political will, and Vajpayee had it. Remember, Vajpayee even wanted to privatize an oil marketing company, but the RSS stepped in and stopped him.
But I would...
Political will could be missing with Mr. Modi.
I don't think it's missing. I honestly don't think it's missing. I think the political will to disinvest is there. I mean, by announcing the disinvestment program, right, you're actually taking most of the political slack that you need to. So why not go ahead, and why have we not seen it happen? I think it's been a bureaucratic failure and not a political failure to deliver on the disinvestment.
Can I quickly point out that, in fact, loud voices from the RSS have already begun to criticize the decision
I agree.
Not just disinvest 2 public sector banks and a general insurance company, but even the LIC IPO, which should have happened last year. And these voices include not just senior leaders of the RSS, but also the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, which is, I believe, the BJP's own trade union. So Mr. Modi's got a political battle, and he needs to show political will to stand up to his own people.
Agreed. Totally so.
Indira Rajaraman, it seems to me that when you look at the budget, the main method of financing the government's deficit is debt. The government will be borrowing, I believe, something like 3,700 crore per day. And I'm told by a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council that this means the interest cost will move from 36% of net revenue receipts this year to 45% next year. How much of a concern is that?
Before I answer that question, which I will in just a moment, Jahangir, did I hear you correctly when you said that the economic survey has projected lower growth? It actually hasn't. It has projected higher growth than the budget. The nominal rate of growth in the economic survey is 15.4%, and in the budget it's 14.4%. And the corresponding
I meant lower growth than what we have.
Yeah.
Than what we have.
What JP Morgan forecasts.
Oh, okay. Coming back to the question that Karan asked, well, you know what the PMEAC member told you, that's arithmetic. But let us look at the more important issue, which is the prospects going ahead. Are we drowning in debt? Is there a way out of it? And the key parameter to look at for that, to determine what the debt trajectory will be, is the nominal rate of growth. If it is higher than the 14.4% projected by the budget, or even if it is at 14.4%, what you get from that is that the closing debt to GDP of this current financial year, which for center and states comes to, let us say, at the upper end of the range of 88 to 90. So let's take it at 90. 90% of GDP is the consolidated debt to GDP expected to be reached at the close of the current financial year, that is to say 31st March 2021. In the next year, if we do get that 14.4% growth at the close of the next financial year, this on its own will be reduced to below 80%, just a little below 80%. Add on the 6% of GDP of the center and something for the states, you go back up to, let's say, about 6, 7, 8%, by 6, 7, 8%. So let's say we close again at 88%. Then the next year, it all depends on what happens to nominal growth. So the key thing to look at when you're assessing growth prospects and debt prospects is to look at what is going to happen to growth. That's why what the budget does for growth is all important. It's not just the fiscal deficit, or it's not just the projected or budgeted disinvestment receipts that is going to determine where we will be. It is the composition of expenditure. And on the disinvestment receipts, let me just add to what Naushad said, which is that the possible proceeds from the LIC IPO have not been included in that 1.75 trillion estimate. And also, the finance minister in an interview has stated that the asset monetization receipts expected from sale of unused government land and so on have also not been included. So I actually expect that this year, the receipts will be in excess of 1.75 lakh crore. If that enables more expenditure, and if that is growth promoting expenditure, it's a very, very critical thing, and we get more real growth, nominal growth, then we can, in principle, see the debt trajectory moving downwards finally after the conclusion of the forthcoming fiscal year.
You raise a very important question. Will we get more growth? Will the debt that we're taking on actually create more growth, or might we end up with inflation? I'm going to simply flag it at this point. I'll bring it up towards the end of this discussion, because I think that's one way of taking a closing overview of the budget, but I'm flagging it to the audience that we'll take that up in a bigger way towards the end. At the moment, Jahangir Aziz, let me raise with you another one of the bold moves made by the finance minister, and that is her way of tackling the financial sector's non-performing assets. The RBI's recent financial stability report said that we could end up with NPAs increasing to 13.5% by September 2021. And for public sector banks specifically, it could shoot up to 16.2%. And as a result, she's created an asset reconstruction company which will tackle this problem. Two quick questions. A, was this the wise and right thing to do? And secondly, are you worried that if you create an ARC, a bad bank that takes over the bad debts, but don't change the governance of the banks, the banks could continue to create NPAs, and this could become just a one-time solution that needs to be repeated every 5 years.
So let me take both questions. Let me take the first question. I think, to be fair to the government has made progress over the last 3 years in tackling the non-performing loans, including with, systematic approach which includes the creation of the bankruptcy code, and prior to that, doing a proper asset quality review. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, reconstruction could not be continued, and therefore, we are not at the point where we should be, but progress had been made. The bad bank idea has been around for quite a while. Previous CEA, Arvind Subramaniam, he championed it. Several countries have used that option, but there are many ways to skin a cat. Do you want to have a very large government-driven bureaucracy that is the ARC, which is what seems to be the case? We don't have very many details of what this asset reconstructing company would look like. Or do you want it to have each bank have its own asset reconstruction company, which several countries have done quite successfully, including China? But as I said, there are ways of doing it. And I would have thought that a much easier way of doing that, if indeed the government wanted to go down that route, instead of creating a bureaucracy, as you pointed out, simply let the Reserve Bank of India take over all the bad loans. Ultimately, we do know that most of the funding will come from the excess capital that Reserve Bank has. Let the RBI take it over. And RBI probably has more knowledge about these loans. And most likely you need to have, governance in the RBI, which keeps it at arm's length. And as part of taking over the bad loans, the RBI essentially asks in return proper changes in the governance of the banks who will be giving up the loans to the RBI.
That second thing hasn't happened. Instead of the RBI taking over the bad loans, an ARC will take over the bad loans, but there's no guarantee that the ARC in return for taking over bad loans will insist on proper, better governance. And so the danger of banks, PSUs in particular, carrying on creating non-performing assets, that danger remains, doesn't it?
That danger remains. And, we have seen how these things can have a life of its own. ARCs never come to an end. It's a bureaucracy that you're creating. It can last forever. So I think that in the absence of actually tackling the governance and this swap between RBI taking over the bank's bad loans and in exchange asking for better governance was to me a more efficient way of dealing things. But whereas, I think, going down the route of just creating a bad bank without, as you pointed out, without the other part of it, just changing the governance, that really leaves behind that risk alive.
I should point out, and not entirely with humor, that a bureaucracy lasting forever would actually appeal to the government of India. It wouldn't put them off. But let me ask you this, Ratin Roy. Do you believe the proposed ARC will effectively bring to an end what's called the twin balance sheet problem that's paralyzed India's economy for several years? Will that come to an end, or do you think that's unlikely? Oh, you muted yourself. I think you muted yourself.
I only have limited agreement with that diagnosis. But the twin balance sheet problem, as it is put, is that corporate balance sheets are stretched because they have sort of over-leveraged finance, just to explain to your viewers. And that we have banks' balance sheets are stressed because they have non-performing assets. Well, the corporates have gone debt-free, haven't they? Lots of them. So what you're getting now is an inequitous twin balance sheet problem, where listed companies have drawn down their debt by making supernormal profits in a year when output has declined. And small enterprises and others continue to have even more stressed balance sheets than they did in the past. That problem will not go away simply by creating a bad bank. The second, I think Jahangir's covered it. Creating a bad bank is like applying an ointment to a wound. It doesn't guarantee that you will not injure yourself again through bad practice. So when we apply ointment, when our children fall down and scratch themselves, we apply ointment. We say, don't do what you did earlier again. And I don't see that conversation forthcoming yet. I think many of the reforms that Jahangir points to will encourage that conversation, but it does need to happen with a private sector that across my lifetime has gotten used to these bailouts. And I also want to endorse what Jahangir said, that in the end, if you these losses will have to be borne by the taxpayer. Just creating an ARC doesn't mean that those losses go away. And the right place to do that is the reserves the Reserve Bank holds to provide systemic confidence. They have lots of reserves. This is a relatively small amount, and they could have done it there. So yes, the ARC will allow us to move forward. But no, I don't know whether when we move forward, we will create further non-performing assets due to rent-seeking, side deals, and general misperception, or we will do the right thing and follow the route of making sure that banks, well, there's a third possibility, which is happening now, that banks just don't lend because they're scared to lend at any level of risk. So banks have to lend money, they have to lend risky money, and we have to find ways in which they do this effectively. And if we can find that path, which the legislation does not prescribe, then yes, this will have worked. Otherwise, it will not.
Absolutely. And just for the sake of the audience, I'll point out that answer had at least 3 big ifs, and we don't know the answer to those 3 big ifs. Rosha, another novel feature hinted at a moment ago by Indira Rajaraman is the asset monetization that's being proposed. We don't know whether it will be implemented, but it's been proposed, and it's been proposed, as far as I know, for the first time in a budget. Not only surplus lands, but the government also intends to sell off airports, roads and highways, sports stadiums, oil and gas pipelines. Now, if all of this is properly handled, it could bring in huge sums of money. But the question is, A, will it be properly handled? Or in this case, does the devil lie very much in the implementation?
Well, I think the devil always lies in the implementation. But if I may, I want to add one sentence on the previous question, which is that the privatization of 2 public sector banks is a step in the right direction to address this permanent fix to the financial sector. Because if you actually privatize banks, then that removes the ability of the political establishment to interfere in the lending process. So it removes that scope for interference. And I think that's something that we should really bank on and push. Because if you look at NPAs in the private sector banks, you have much lower levels of NPAs in private sector banks than public sector banks, and for all these reasons. Come to your question on asset monetization. It has great potential, not only in terms of raising money, but it has great potential in terms of actually putting assets to more productive use. So I think it has a dual benefit. It will raise finance for the government, which can be used in other ways. And it will also turn these assets into something that can be much more productively used. If you take the use of land, for example, it's a huge opportunity to actually see much more development of housing or whatever than we currently see when it's actually owned by public enterprises. So I think there's a great opportunity there. How do you do it effectively? I think to do it effectively, we will need some kind of separate institutional mechanism. I do not know what that institutional mechanism is. It's not my area of expertise at all. But I think it's been done by different countries around the world. And it can be done in an efficient, effective way in a separate, if it's handled in a separate entity and not done as a part of each department, each ministry handling its own asset monetization piece.
All right, it's a bit like disinvestment. Not only do you need a special mechanism to handle it, but also you need the political will to go through with it. But once again, just like disinvestment or privatization, this will be a test of Mr. Modi's intent and his capacity to face up to resistance, a lot of which will come internally from his own party or his own supporters in the RSS. We're coming to the end of this discussion. I want to put different sorts of questions which try and assess how you believe this budget will work out over the year as a whole. Let me start with you, Indira Rajaraman, and pick up on that thought that you were expressing a moment ago in your last answer. What do you see will be the state of the economy 1 year down the road? Will this budget generate the sort of growth that you believe is essential, or at least is intended? Or is there a danger that we could be wallowing in debt and also facing surging inflation?
Um, 1 year down the line, where will we be? A difficult question to answer. Let me just say that notwithstanding all the criticism that I've heard on this panel, I think the budget does display cognizance by the government of the need to get growth going again, and that the government itself is invested in the need to pull the economy out of this terrible hole into which we dropped, in principle for no fault of our own, except that the economy had already been slowing for 8 successive quarters before COVID began. So I think the cognizance of the need to pull out of this hole and commitment to it does exist, because, and I'm mentioning that because you were mentioning political will. It's possible that there have to be internal battles that have to be fought by the government within its own party. But I think I do see intent, positive intent. That said, let me mention that there is one thing that worries me acutely. This virus, which precipitated this problem, although once again, as I mentioned, we were already slowing in terms of growth for 8 successive quarters, but this virus was what really plunged us. The recent decline in the incidence of COVID and of COVID-related deaths in India has mystified epidemiologists and the medical profession all over the world. They simply don't understand why or how it has happened. Has it been because mask wearing was enforced very rigidly here? Has it been because of some conditions peculiar to India? There is no answer to this. And because this is such a mystifying thing, what I fear is that an equally mystifying rise in incidence and rise in deaths may come upon us. So I'm really quite nervous about the fact that we don't understand why the COVID incidence has dropped. But let us hope for the best. Let us go with Ram Bharosa, and let us say that COVID does not increase. What are the prospects 1 year hence? It's very much a function of what the government does in 2 respects. One is, I've already mentioned, and I want to mention again, remove the fear of mobility from people by doing the vaccination program with determination, but without forcing unwanted vaccinations on people who don't want them. There is a trust deficit there. There are people who are distrustful of the vaccines. They think they are being made into guinea pigs for an untested vaccine. And those doubts and suspicions have to be overcome by the government, not through force, but by constant communication. And the second thing that the government has to do is to pay more attention to processes going into laws so that we don't precipitate the kind of farmer protest that we have now, because the more this kind of protest and stoppage of movement of cargo and people that we have, the more our growth ambitions will be threatened. So it is critically important that the government should improve its communication strategy with the people, remove the trust deficit, and get the trust of the people back.
The line that struck me, and I'm sure it will strike the audience, is that at least some of the year ahead is Ram Bharose, and I'll also add Allah Rakha. I'm not sure what the phrase to get the goodwill of the Christian God would be, but if it is there, let's have his blessings as well. Jahangir Aziz, does this budget make India a more exciting place for foreign investors? I'm not just talking about foreign insurance companies for whom now up to 79% is possible. I'm also talking about sovereign investment funds and perhaps companies that want to relocate from China, who the government in particular is keen to attract. Is it attracting for all of them? Is it more attractive for all of them?
So let me just separate the 2 questions. So on the first one, will foreign investors be excited about India? India is going to post one of the largest growth recoveries among emerging market countries. So naturally, there will be flows coming into India. I think, mostly it'll be equity flows, which we have missed in 2020. It'll be less FDI because there are no specific one-off FDI deals that we saw in 2020. Bonds will likely struggle simply because things are very difficult for people to make money on the bond market. Let me go to the second question that you raised. Is this something where funds are going to get diversified from global allocation into China? We haven't really seen any evidence of that, despite the US-China trade war, despite the pandemic. The only people who seem to be diversifying out of China are Chinese residents, both on the industry where they're opening up industries elsewhere, as well as in portfolio. And just to give you some sense that the opposite is also happening. So if you look at the total amount of bond inflows into Asia, ex-Japan and China, since January of 2020, $158 billion of money went into the bond market in Asia, of which 155 billion went to China. And many will argue that the reason as to why the money went into China, because China entered into global bond indices. But that got over in December. So just look at January so far till date, $35 billion have gone into China, and the rest of Asia, including India, only $2 billion has gone into it. I think there's a reason. I think these ideas that there's going to be a massive diversion of funds away from China into India, we have not seen any evidence of that. And if I look forward, JP Morgan's own forecast suggests that by 2030, China will become the largest country, overtaking US. So I think, these comparisons and hopes that there's going to be a massive diversion of funds, hasn't, as I said, we haven't seen any of it. Doesn't seem likely. I think India should focus on its own problems, and will continue to attract capital.
Let me ask you, Ratin Roy, a very different type of overview question. On the one hand, the finance minister has broken taboos and is willing to privatize PSUs and insurance companies. On the other hand, she's rejected the temptation to either impose a wealth tax or a one-off tax on the super rich. There's a clear ideological message there. And I'm sure she intends that to be seen and heard loud and clear. Is it a message you approve of for a country like India? You're muted. You need to press your button.
What is the message? I get no message from that.
Well, the message as translated by Shekhar Gupta in the Business Standard is this is the first BJP budget. The first time he says we are moving sharply to the right, and it picks up on the thought that you began your first answer with: not enough has been done for those who have suffered, the people who've lost income, the people who've lost jobs, the people who needed income support. It ties up with that first answer. Hence, I ask you, do you move off this ideological message?
No, well, I don't think that's the message that she wanted to send. I should hope not, because it is not the monopoly of the right not to increase taxes on income and wealth in the middle of a pandemic. Wealth taxes are notoriously unreliable as aggregate collectors of fiscal income. There's a rule in public finance, which is tax assets, tax rents, don't tax profits and wages if you can. The reason we tax profits and wages is it's very difficult to tax assets and rents, right? So that is, I think the finance ministry was just being wise, not going down that wild goose chase path. Record would have been probably even worse than disinvestment. On the other side, I'll wait till I see those intentions fructifying. I haven't seen that yet. I have not seen a single genuine privatization, as Mr. Forbes was pointing out, since 2002. Anything that this government is doing that you can call right-wing or even worse is happening in the Home Ministry, not in the Ministry of Finance, I'm afraid. Okay. So until the Ministry of Finance gets a jolly sight more efficient, perhaps using the efficiency of the Home Ministry as a benchmark, I think to talk about right and left is futile in the context of the Finance Ministry.
Very interesting. The Home Ministry delivers on the government's intents, if I can interpret your answer that way.
Yes,
the Finance Ministry has to prove that it can deliver on the government's intents, and therefore This talk about privatizing PSU banks and insurance companies is all intent and rhetoric. There are big question marks about delivery. Finally, Mr. Forbes, you're an industrialist. One of the intentions of this budget is to have you jumping in your seat with excitement. At the moment, you're sitting very placidly still. Are your animal spirits fired up, or does that engine need to be ignited a bit more?
So, I'm on a panel with 3 economists. I'm only a make-believe economist. So, I'm going to answer.
Don't speak as an economist. Speak as an industrialist.
No. I'm going to. So, in deference to them, I'm going to give the classic economist answer, which is it depends, right? And it depends on a few different things. It depends on exactly what you mentioned just now, implementation of what we heard in the budget. Because if we see actual movement on privatization soon, in the next 3 months, and I'm not saying you actually have the privatization take place, but you hear how it's going to happen. You hear the confrontation taking place in terms of, opposition from within the party, outside the party, whatever, and how it's being dealt with. You see that actually, you see movement taking place towards privatization. I will start having greater faith that yes, we're going to see things implemented in the budget as was announced. So I think it depends on that. Second, it depends also on what Indira mentioned in terms of the vaccine rollout. We have a huge opportunity as a country. I mean, I fully agree with her. No one knows why we're doing as well as we are with the current spread of infection. And I have the same fear that just as we don't know why we're doing so well, we may not know why it comes back. So I think we have to vaccinate really aggressively, really quickly, as soon as we can, so that before it starts coming back, we remove that risk to a substantial extent. And we have the opportunity to do it because we have the world's largest vaccine manufacturers in India. We have, in my city, we have Serum Institute sitting with 100 million doses lying ready with them. This is a huge opportunity that no other country has. And I think to actually make the program move, we need to see much more private sector involvement in the vaccination program, much more of the government stepping out of the way so that vaccines can flow. And if a few thousand or 100,000 people get vaccines out of turn that they shouldn't have, we simply say, shame on you for actually doing that, and get on with the actual job of getting these 100 million vaccines out to people. And then let Serum keep making its 100 million vaccines a month, which is the capacity they say they can put in place by March. No other country has the ability to actually do this effectively. And if we do that, right, I think we will be the envy of the world in more ways than one. Okay. Jahangir and all other companies will be lining up to invest in India, simply saying that, listen, actually, you take a really huge challenge like this and you do it really effectively using the strengths that the country has of, yes, the state playing some role, but relying on the private sector to actually spread in volume. So it depends.
The phrase you use so evocatively right through that answer, it depends. And what that suggests to me, with regard to that question about your animal spirits, is that the hound in you is still in the kennel. He's not racing to get out. You're waiting.
No, right.
And it all depends. I thank all my guests for joining me. I also thank Professor Jayati Ghosh, who had to leave us early. She's a member of a new commission set up by the United Nations, and the Secretary General has called her, and unfortunately, he took precedence over us. My thanks to all of you for joining me. Take care, and let's hope it doesn't depend for too long.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.